The Process, a podcast about creativity and experimental music. In the world of experimental music, outcomes and accolades for creators can be uncertain and at times seem far and few between. Therefore, creators and practitioners of experimental music must embrace the one thing they will always have complete control over: the process. This podcast aims to understand this creative process by listening to new works and discussing them with their creators. Each episode focuses on one creator and their music. Understanding how and why they create can inform aspiring creatives and help audiences better understand and navigate experimental music. I'm Dr. Doug Bielmeyer, and I'll be your host as we explore the world of experimental music, creativity, and the human need to find purpose in their world and lives. This is The Process.
After I had witnessed Alexander Calder Mobile in 2003, it kind of changed the way I think about the way things go together. Mm-hmm. I started working with small groups of notes, 3 to 4 to 5 groups of notes, and treating them like modes. And I would create patterns out of those, minimalistic sort of patterns. Yeah. And then immediately after that, influenced mainly by Indian approach to rhythmic cycle, I'll create some sort of telescoping pattern or something.
Right.
And then I would always overlay that with a melody, but I would always retain just those 3 to 5 notes. Mm-hmm. And then once that cycle ends, I will go back and collect more notes that I haven't used yet. So there's a sort of a tonal goal of using all 12 and creating modes out of them. Yeah. So each section will feature a new, fresh set of notes.
So you mentioned there was an experience that you had that sort of prompted you to sort of change your approach, or what was your approach previously to that? Was it just...
Well, yeah, I think anything that I wrote between 1996 and 2003 was me trying to be somebody that could be taken seriously in a graduate composition program.
Right.
And everything was an experiment. And I think that I ended up throwing every single one of those out. with the exception of one or two. But I was frustrated. I was ready to quit in the middle of my doctoral degree in 2003. And I went with my wife to Washington, D.C. and saw Calder. And I was just, the lights went on. I thought, this is how music is supposed to be made.
Explain that to us. What is Calder? I'm not familiar.
Oh, Alexander Calder, kinetic sculpture. If you ever get a chance to go see anything by Calder, or you can Google it, they're these massive room-sized pieces, mobiles,
right?
Essentially, and the pieces are, big chunks of, I don't know. Sometimes they just look like wreckage, which is part of the appeal. But they're not just sitting there. They're moving, and often in these big, huge rooms with the sun's coming through, and you got the shadows on the back wall. They're creating this object that's, I don't know how else to describe the impact it had on me personally. That's the most beautiful thing I think I've ever seen.
So it's sort of geometric. It's made from kind of like found things. And then you're saying it's even interacting like not just as a thing, but also with the lighting and the environment. So
and if a group of people go through, it moves the wind. It creates a wind, and the things start to move. So the way that this object feels or looks changes in relation to the other object. And that was just revolutionary to me. And so the first thing I did when I came home was write a piece in mobile form for two pianos, where they're reading from the same score, and the only rules are you have to play each block. There's 6 blocks twice in any order, and you can't tell the other guy what you're doing. So it's a completely indeterminate composition,
right? But they're going to be musicians, and they're going to listen to each other and kind of have a response to what they're hearing, and
except that each block is specifically composed. So like there are some sections that are fortissimo, and some are rather like gentle and swaying, and you don't know when the two are going to collide or not, and you just have to stay committed to your little chunk of music. I never did that again, but it was a great groundbreaking, because after that I started just collecting little groups of notes and then playing with that and thinking, I don't need to develop, I don't need it to have form, I don't need to have anything. And then they started to kind of generate their own motion.
Right.
And then I don't know why, I just start putting melodies on everything. That's kind of what I do. And that's how I've been writing since 2007. Everything starts the same way.
But it has this, like you said, a telescoping type effect, and I've heard that in some of the pieces that I've heard of yours, where there is this sort of like it expands and contracts, almost like those mobiles reacting to the wind.
Absolutely.
So you got this really profound, you saw this profound visual art or sculpture, and so you went and wrote some pieces. Where do you normally go when you get inspired? Are you going to an instrument? Are you just going to the paper? What are you doing?
Straight to the piano. I have been playing piano, improvising. There's a lot to that story if you're interested. But at age 13, I was playing in church in a Pentecostal environment.
Sure.
So the first thing that I did was learn to improvise. I was improvising before I knew how to read music. So when I go to the piano now, I go quicker to notation than I used to, but I'll go to the piano to collect notes. And I have a sense of, okay, that interval and that interval would sound really cool together, creating pitch class sets essentially. But I use those as modes. I find a group of notes and I'll write it down on a piece of paper and then leave it there. So it's like going out into nature and finding rocks or something, or walking on the shore and finding seashells. You're finding this material, and I just leave it alone for a day or two, and then I'll try to see what kind of animating thing it'll do on its own.
See, that's interesting. With the pieces that I've heard of yours, I often am like, oh, I hear these notes and I hear the sort of harmonic tradition that, I grew up, and I'll be like, oh, it's going to go there. And it doesn't. and that note or that chord is not included, and it's partially because maybe that's not one of the rocks that you picked up or one of the notes.
Precisely. I really appreciated set theory. I don't write dissonant music, but I love set theory because how it enables me to escape from calling things by their letter names.
Right.
I use the numbers if I look at like the first three notes of the KUBIN piece, or the second movement of the KUBIN piece, I used a cipher to use KUBIN, and I ended up with A flat, B flat, and D flat. If I think of those as A flat, B flat, and D flat, I can't help but think of it as pentatonic or something. But if I think of them as 8, 10, and 1, it kind of revolutionizes the whole thing. Francesco Zago is the guitarist, and I actually met him through one of my students as early as 2009, 2011. And his history was in Prague, and kind of even the avant classical niche of Prague, centered in Milan and England, called, I don't know if you've heard of this, Doug, but it's rock and opposition movement. He had gotten involved with that in his teens. So this is mid 80s, early 90s. And when I finally just gotten to a point, 2016, when I was like, I'm ready to step away from academia. First thing I did was call Francesco up and say, what would it take to do a record? That was question one. Question two is, do you need a keyboardist? And I'll go over there and play in your band. So we started making albums together, 2017. And those years between 2016 up into 2020 was fantastic for both of us, because he had the connections in Milan, and he was asking me for more music, and I was planning on going over. In 2018, he and his wife, Elena Tallarico, the pianist, they weren't married at this point, decided, hey, let's do a record of guitar and piano. And Elena had played piano on pretty much everything I'd written for them up to that point. So they decided to make a record of electric guitar and piano, and asked me to write a piece on that collection.
And so I make this statement. I made the statement that there wasn't a lot of guitar effects. But I feel like after listening now several times, there are these like really kind of subtle, interesting things that are happening. And I also wondered too, there's some things that I'm like, were these album things that were happening, or were these performance things? And I find myself, when I'm like creating, I'm like, okay, well, this is the album version versus what's going to actually happen in a performance, or do I even care about performance? So talk about your use of guitar effects. Is this and production in general? Because like sometimes I'm like, is there overdubbing? Is this just like live looping? Like what's happening? Can you just like talk a minute about that?
There's one spot where I wrote guitar in my very, very limited understanding of the instrument, first of all, in two parts. Like I thought, well, I kind of puzzled it out thinking, well, if I can do it on guitar, Francesca can do it.
Sure.
He ended up overdubbing, and he ended up doing two guitars. So there was overdubbing, but that was the only spot that I know of where he overdubbed. As far as effects, that was entirely his choice, because for directions, I put things like frip, like the first section of the second movement. I just wrote frip and put it in a little box, knowing that he would know, because we both dig King Crimson.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And then the beginning of I guess it's the first movement. I notated as an alop, and then I put Gilmore.
Okay. So Pink Floyd inspired. Yeah.
And that's as much guitar knowledge as I had. And he would send me snippets to say, here it is on this guitar with this effect. I'm like, okay. And then he'd send me another file. This is this guitar with this effect. I'm like, okay. And then I'd choose which one. I had no idea what I was listening to. I'm an idiot.
Sure. What was your guiding light then? If you were just getting these and you weren't sure maybe what he was doing, what was your guiding light? Did you have a specific tone in mind, or was it more of like a variety of options?
When I think of Robert Fripp, that's a very specific, usually it's a very specific guitar sound, or Gilmore as the Stratocaster sound.
Yeah.
That was as far as I could take that. I mean, I listened to a lot of rock, but I don't know how people. I know that there's a great deal of difference between one guitar and the other, and then all of the effects. It's like endless.
Yeah, and sometimes I said there wasn't a lot of effects because I still heard the guitar. Like sometimes I'm used to at this point now, like hearing a piece for guitar, and I'm like, wait, that was guitar? Like I didn't even, it's just like a wash. It's like a 30-minute soundscape, and you're like, wait, that was all created via guitar and EBow. But this had nice moments of like really subtle effects with also kind of, like you said, sort of classic guitar tones. And that's the tricky part about guitar. There's so much in popular culture. There's so much history about how a guitar sounds. And sometimes too, you can be in the middle of one piece, and because you're referencing like Gilmore or Fripp, and is it Gilmore from like old Pink Floyd or new Pink Floyd, old Pink Floyd, right? So then all of a sudden you're like in the year 1976, I feel like, with guitar tones, or you're in a very specific genre or time. Did that worry you at all about the piece? Like just like being kind of sort of, the context?
I'd heard him play enough on his own recordings to know what Zago sounded like. So there were a couple times where I just said Zago. And what he sent back to me was like, that's exactly what I was thinking. So we've just shared so many ideas for, over a decade of music we both like. And I just completely trusted him. You mentioned EBow, and I definitely used that. And I took that, using that as an opportunity to get beyond the fretboard at times.
Right. Yeah.
And I just knew he could nail that intonation wise. He's such a good player.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about the first part. So there's two parts, and I really do feel like they're connected, the two parts, because I think there's some things you're doing in the first part of the meditations on that are sort of foreshadowing, or at least in my mind, when I'm trying to conceptualize this as two parts of a whole, there is definitely, I heard, some foreshadowing, but the piece begins with this really beautiful large piano chord. And then there's sort of the aftertone of that. And I equated it sort of to a harmonium, or just this like, droning that's happening. And that's, I really wondered about that. Like you don't have to give away the trade secrets here, but what was happening after that initial chord, it's almost like the sustain pedal was left on, and then there was some type of feedback. It felt like almost like where that sort of kind of started to swell. It was a really interesting moment.
And this is where we'd have to go talk to Francesco, because
what did you do there?
All I wrote was that chord you're mentioning, which is really just an octave, another octave, and a fifth. And I wrote hold for about 30 to 40 seconds till you've almost forgotten that you ever played it.
Right.
And then I start with that alop pattern that you get on a tampura, the so do do do, asymmetrically. And then I wrote out that Gilmore section like I was writing a chant. It looks like modern notation of Gregorian chant.
The piece in general is a very sort of meditative and sort of, very stable. But there's this really interesting thing that it's immediately striking. It's this break at around 6 minutes, and it only lasts for about a minute of the whole piece, which is about probably 9 minutes. But it's this break to this very frenetic. It feels like it's in a different pitch world key. We talked about keys aren't really a thing that you're addressing, but it felt like it was in a totally different pitch center, and it was strikingly frenetic compared to what we had heard prior.
Yeah, well, I mean, for meditation in particular, at least my experience of it, and I battle with anxiety. I think a lot of us do, but. When my process ends, that symmetrical, usually a rhythmic cycle process ends, then it's a good opportunity for me to bring in a fresh set of notes. But the meditation process for me usually is exactly like you just mentioned. I'm in this space, and often that comes with a sort of awakening moment where you've kind of gotten into another level of awareness, and the lights come on. So I feel like I'm always trying to do that. There's like this center section, really beautiful, sometimes even sad, quiet meditation thing, and then suddenly you wake up. So, and then a fresh.
I interpreted it more as sort of like I'm trying to focus here. I'm trying to recite the mantra. Like I'm trying to, like be the frog. Like I'm trying to do like whatever my mantra is, right? Like I'm trying to do that. And then I remember I have to call somebody or I have to do, so I get kind of pulled out. But you're saying it's kind of like that you get so calm that then your brain, starts to fire.
That's the awakened moment.
Yeah.
And the reality is true. I mean, in practice, in meditation, usually I feel like, okay, if I can do 60 seconds today of true openness, I've succeeded, because it's just a pure battle to quiet the mind. And you just have to, some days are just like that.
Yeah.
Well, that's a long story, and feel free to cut me off when it gets long. But for me, I mentioned earlier, it started with the Pentecostal tradition of improvisation, and I would find out later that the music we were making, I'm 13, I have nothing to compare it to, was a lot like the open improvs with the Grateful Dead. The same kind of thing, with frankly the same effect and goal. Sort of just open up the moment. And then when I got into college, I don't exactly know what the impetus was, but I started looking into other religious traditions, and the first one I looked at was Hindu, which, what's the connection? I have no idea what the connection was there. I was really into Close to the Edge and Tales from Topographic Oceans and the Beatles' Revolver album. Maybe I think it might have been the Revolver album. Hearing Indian music, I thought, I'm interested in that, and then learn about the music and the religion, and I started seeing all these similarities. So the long story, the short version of this long story is that with each investigation of some other practice or tradition, I just see similarities. That the goal is the same, is to surrender to the moment. And from that, probably because I started making music in that way, I can't separate them. For me, making music and spiritual pursuit or seeking are synonymous.
I find sometimes people, when I talk to composers or creators, they have like different bands. Do you know what I mean by that? So like they'll do like the composition with a capital C, but then they'll also have this other like side project where they do like death metal or something, something like that. Right. And like, I always wondered about that. For me, it's always like, I do this music thing, and this music thing is like, it's everything. And sometimes it's poppy, sometimes it includes all these things that other people might say should not meet. Do you find, like you were just talking about, like things that people often say, these are separate ideologies, these are separate genres. You see the relationship between the two, and that's something that I inherently do as well. I see them as being connected.
I absolutely do. Yeah, I don't see any difference, and I know that would really upset people to say that kind of thing. That in fact, I know they would to say, I'm sorry that chanting this mantra is no different to me than whatever utterances you might do in a church service. It's the same goal. There's only one spirit. So to me, it all seems like the same activity.
Well, Bill, this has been fantastic. Thanks for taking the time to share your time in music with me. I really enjoyed listening to this piece. Before I let you go, where can we go to find out more about you and your music?
So I'm working really hard to get all of my stuff at my website. So billwhitleymusic.com. And you can find me on the socials under the same name. I only do Instagram really these days. Links to my recordings are there on a recordings menu, and then a list of my works. And I'm slowly making all my scores available for sale there on the site. So yeah, it's all there at that website.
Thanks to Bill for sharing his time in music with us. If you enjoyed this episode, please check out other episodes in the series. And as always, like, subscribe, or leave a comment on your preferred podcasting app. I'm Dr. Doug Bielmeyer, and this has been The Process.